In the hushed stillness of a courtroom, where justice is unwavering and rules are set in stone, one small voice broke through the heavy silence. It wasn't a lawyer making an objection, nor a defendant pleading their case. It was the innocent voice of a child. A 6-year-old girl, standing beside her mother, looked up at the imposing figure of Judge Richard Alden and, with all the sincerity of childhood, asked, "Can we get pancakes?" The room froze. Every breath seemed to catch midair. The mother's face turned pale, her heart hammering inside her chest. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, some in disbelief, others in barely concealed amusement. The bailiff shifted awkwardly, and even the stenographer, who had dutifully recorded countless testimonies, hesitated with her fingers poised over the keys. But the most surprising reaction came from Judge Alden himself. This was a man renowned for his strict, unbending rulings. His name carried weight throughout the legal system, his reputation cemented by years of enforcing the law without exception. To many, he was more a force of nature than a man cold, decisive, and immovable. And yet, at that moment he paused. He studied the small girl before him, her big, hopeful eyes staring back. The courtroom, which had moments ago been filled with tension and rigid formality, now held something else: curiosity, anticipation, even a flicker of warmth. What happened next would leave a lasting impact not only on those present that day, but on countless others who would later hear of it. This is a story of justice and compassion, of an unexpected moment of kindness in a place ruled by rules. It is a story of how one child's innocence challenged a hardened man's resolve and reminded everyone that sometimes humanity matters just as much as the law. Before we continue, let me ask you this. If you were in Judge Alden's position, what would you do? Would you uphold the law without question, or would you consider the circumstances, even for a moment? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of kindness, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul. The morning air was crisp as Sarah Thompson stepped out of her small apartment, her daughter Emma's tiny hand nestled in hers. It should have been just another ordinary day, but instead of heading to the bakery where she worked long hours, Sarah found herself walking towards the Brooklyn courthouse. Her stomach was tight with worry. Balancing work, bills, and raising a 6-year-old alone wasn't easy. Every paycheck was stretched thin, every unexpected expense a potential disaster. The parking ticket she received the week before felt like a cruel joke. $200 she simply didn't have. She hadn't meant to break the law, but when Emma had spiked a high fever, getting her medicine had been the only thing on Sarah's mind. The nearest parking spot happened to be in a handicapped zone. It was a mistake, but one made out of desperation. Now, standing before the towering figure of Judge Richard Alden, Sarah felt as though the walls of the courtroom were closing in on her. Alden was notorious for his strict rulings and unwavering commitment to the letter of the law, the kind of judge who left no room for leniency. Sarah swallowed hard as her case was called. Clutching Emma's hand, she stepped forward. The courtroom was silent, filled with people waiting for their own cases, some watching with curiosity, others with indifference. "Miss Thompson," Judge Alden's deep voice rang through the room. He barely glanced up from the papers in front of him. "You have been cited for illegally parking in a handicapped zone. Do you contest the charge?" Sarah took a deep breath. "No, Your Honor. I don't." "Then why are we here?" His voice was firm, unwavering. Sarah's hands trembled slightly. I made a mistake. My daughter was sick, and I needed to get her medicine. It was late, I was exhausted, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I only left my car there for a few minutes. I understand that I broke the law, but I was out of options." Judge Alden remained impassive. "The law doesn't consider personal circumstances, Miss Thompson. A handicapped space is designated for those who need it, not those in a hurry." Sarah's heart sank. She had expected this, but the finality of his words still hit hard. The weight of her situation pressed heavily upon her shoulders. Then, in the dead silence of the courtroom, a small voice piped up. "Can we get pancakes, please?" Gasps rippled through the room. A murmur of quiet amusement followed. Sarah's face flushed hot as she turned to Emma, who stood beside her, entirely unaware of the weight of the moment. Judge Alden blinked. His pen, which had been poised to sign off on her case, hovered in midair. Slowly, he lifted his gaze from the papers and looked directly at the child. "What did you just say?" His tone was not harsh, but puzzled. Emma met his gaze with innocent confidence. "Can we get pancakes? With syrup?" The courtroom burst into hushed chuckles. The bailiff let out a cough that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Even the court reporter, usually stoic and unreadable, seemed to suppress a smile. Judge Alden stared at the little girl for a long moment. Then something changed in his expression. His brows furrowed, not in irritation, but in contemplation. He looked back at Sarah, then at Emma again. A moment passed, and then another. "Court is in recess," he suddenly declared, his voice breaking through the low hum of amusement in the room. Stunned silence fell over the crowd. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Even the courtroom officials exchanged glances of surprise. Judge Alden stood, his black robe shifting as he stepped away from the bench and disappeared through a side door. The courtroom remained frozen for a beat longer, then erupted into hushed whispers. Sarah looked down at Emma, who was still holding her hand, blissfully unaware of the stir she had just caused. "Mommy," Emma whispered, tugging gently on her sleeve. "Do you think he likes pancakes, too?" Sarah let out a small, breathy laugh. She had no idea what was happening, but for the first time that morning, the overwhelming weight of worry lifted, just a little bit. The murmurs in the courtroom faded as Judge Alden stepped into his chambers, shutting the heavy wooden door behind him. He exhaled deeply, his usually rigid posture softening as he removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. The weight of his black robe suddenly felt heavier than ever. He had presided over thousands of cases, some tragic, some infuriating, others routine. But none had ever made him pause quite like this one. He settled into his chair, the worn leather creaking under his weight. His mind drifted back to the sight of that little girl, Emma, so small, so unbothered by the formalities of the courtroom, asking for pancakes as if she were sitting at the breakfast table rather than standing in front of a judge known for his unyielding nature. There had been no fear in her eyes, no hesitation, just the simple honesty of a child who didn't yet understand the burden of the world around her. Alden leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk, his fingers intertwined. He had been raised to believe in the strict application of the law. Rules were rules. They existed to maintain order, to ensure fairness, to prevent chaos. But as he sat there in the silence of his office, another memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought about in years. He saw himself as a young boy, no older than Emma, sitting at a scratched-up kitchen table, watching his mother divide a single plate of food between the two of them. His mother had always worked hard, taking extra shifts, sewing clothes late into the night just to make ends meet. And yet, there had been nights when dinner was nothing more than a slice of bread and a glass of water. He remembered the ache of hunger, the quiet worry in his mother's eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. Alden's chest tightened. He had spent a lifetime ensuring the law was upheld, that justice was served without bias. But for the first time in a long time, he questioned what justice really meant. Was it just about punishment, or was it also about understanding? Could it be both? He sighed again, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't a sentimental man, and he had never allowed personal emotions to influence his decisions. But this wasn't just about a parking ticket. It was about a struggling mother, a little girl who didn't yet understand hardship but would, all too soon. It was about the realization that sometimes mercy carried more weight than the law itself. Alden straightened, his decision made. He reached for the case file, his fingers lingering over the paper for a moment before he flipped it open again. No one in that courtroom had expected him to do anything but enforce the fine. And perhaps, if it had been anyone else, he might have. But not this time. He stood, smoothing down the front of his robe, feeling a sense of resolve he hadn't in years. This wasn't just about legal technicalities. This was about doing what was right. And as he reached for the doorknob, ready to return to the courtroom, he knew this would be a moment people wouldn't forget. Not Sarah, not Emma, and certainly not himself. Judge Alden stepped back into the courtroom, his expression unreadable. The murmurs that had filled the room just moments before disappeared, replaced by a heavy silence as all eyes turned toward him. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers briefly tightening around the frame before setting them back on his nose. Then, clearing his throat, he looked directly at Sarah. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice firm but not unkind, "you parked illegally. That is a fact. The law is clear on this matter." Sarah's stomach twisted into knots. She felt Emma's small hand squeeze hers, and she clutched it tightly, bracing herself for the inevitable verdict. But Judge Alden continued, pausing for effect. "Justice is not just about punishment. It is about understanding." A collective hush fell over the room. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Had she heard him correctly? The judge leaned forward slightly. "Given your circumstances, your clean record, and your dedication as a mother, I am dismissing your fine." For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Then, a wave of murmurs rippled through the audience, followed by gasps, then scattered applause. The tension that had gripped Sarah's body melted away as tears welled in her eyes. She turned to Emma, who was beaming up at her, unaware of the depth of what had just happened. But Judge Alden wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he said, reaching for a folder on his desk, "I am providing you with a list of local programs that offer child care support, financial assistance, and scholarship opportunities for single parents." A court officer stepped forward and handed Sarah the document. Her hands trembled as she took it, scanning the words through a blur of tears. It wasn't just a reprieve. It was a chance, an opportunity to build something better for herself and Emma. She swallowed the lump in her throat, finally managing a whisper. "Thank you, Your Honor." Emma tugged at her sleeve, her voice innocent and sweet. "Mommy, does that mean we can get pancakes now?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Alden, known for his stern demeanor, let a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "Go enjoy some pancakes, young lady," he said warmly. The room filled with quiet chuckles, and Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. As she turned to leave, she caught the judge's gaze one last time. There was something different there, a glimmer of understanding, of humanity beneath the robes and rules. Stepping out of the courtroom, Sarah felt lighter than she had in years. Emma skipped beside her, giggling as she chanted about pancakes. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah believed that things might just get better. The story of Judge Alden's unexpected decision spread like wildfire. It started with murmurs in the courtroom, whispers exchanged between lawyers and clerks, before making its way beyond those walls. By the next morning, local news stations were picking it up, headlines capturing the rare moment of compassion in a place so often defined by rigid law. Soon, it was everywhere, on radio talk shows, in newspapers, even on national television. People debated it over coffee, shared their thoughts at dinner tables, and for once, the conversation about justice wasn't just about punishment, but about humanity. For Sarah, the judge's kindness was more than just a news story. It was life-changing. Holding that list of resources in her hands, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. She wasted no time. Within weeks, she enrolled in an online degree program, choosing business administration, a field she never thought she'd have the chance to study. With better childcare support, she was able to reduce her long shifts at the bakery and start focusing on her own dreams. It wasn't easy. Balancing work, school, and raising Emma took patience and endurance, but for the first time, she was working towards something that felt within reach. Months passed, and little by little, her efforts paid off. She completed her courses with high marks and, with a small grant, took the first steps toward opening her own bakery. A cozy little shop with warm lighting and the smell of fresh bread drifting onto the street. Customers, drawn in by both the delicious treats and the heartwarming story behind them, quickly turned into regulars. But Sarah wasn't the only one changed by that day in the courtroom. Judge Alden found himself thinking about it often. It wasn't just the little girl's request for pancakes that had stayed with him. It was the realization that justice wasn't only about enforcing the law, but about seeing people, truly seeing them. He had spent his career priding himself on fairness, but fairness wasn't always the same as kindness, and in that moment, he had chosen to be kind. Months later, on a bright Saturday morning, Sarah and Emma sat together at their small kitchen table. The bakery had closed early for the day, and the two of them were enjoying a rare, slow breakfast at home. Emma, swinging her legs beneath her chair, took a bite of her pancake and looked up at her mother with a curious smile. "Do you think the nice judge likes pancakes?" she asked, grinning. Sarah chuckled, shaking her head as she buttered another piece of toast. "I think he does, sweetheart," she said softly. "I really think he does. Life is filled with choices, and sometimes the smallest act of kindness can make the biggest difference. One moment of understanding, one decision to show compassion instead of strictness, can alter the course of a person's life forever." Judge Alden had spent years upholding the law, ensuring that rules were followed to the letter. But on that day, in that quiet courtroom, he chose to see beyond the legal code and into the heart of a struggling mother and her child. If a man known for his unyielding adherence to justice could find room in his heart to offer grace, what does that say about the rest of us? Imagine the impact we could have if we all took a moment to pause, listen, and understand before casting judgment. How many lives could be changed? How many futures could be rewritten? Now, I turn to you. Do you believe justice should always be absolute, or is there room for compassion? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's start a conversation. Leave your opinion in the comments below, because your voice matters. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of kindness, take a moment to share it. Like this post, pass it along to a friend, and help us continue to spread stories that inspire hope and change. Because sometimes the world doesn't need another rule. It just needs a little warmth. And sometimes, all it takes is a plate of pancakes to remind us of what truly matters.